My mom sometimes swears I spent a past life at war. The reason is that when I was just 2, I'd hit the ground flat when a plane flew overhead. Like I was preparing for an incoming attack. The truth is just that I was an anxious kid. I wasn't diagnosed with anxiety until I hit my 20s, but all the signs were pretty clearly there. I was painfully shy, plagued by random migraines, prone to biting my fingernails. And every night, I'd lie in bed awake, running scenarios, worrying about the worst. I grew up on the coast of Oregon in an earthquake and tsunami zone, so there was a lot to keep me up at night. I imagined this huge wave that would envelop the whole town I lived in. Like, you know the logo for the brand Quicksilver? It's okay if you don't. It's just this big wave rising over the top of a mountain. Basically, I thought a tsunami was that. At school, we had earthquake drills and assemblies to learn what to do if a tsunami hit. Looking back, I can't actually remember a word they said. It was all kind of drowned out by the high-pitched ring of fear. Which might be why it also took me to my 20s to realize what a tsunami even is. Not that one big wave I'd imagined as a kid, but something more like a fast-rising tide. Calm enough to trick its victims into complacence, but still dangerous enough to level an entire town. I'm Lacey Healy, and this week on Things That Go Boom, this is not a drill. We've been thinking a lot about tsunamis this season because they happen to be a pretty good metaphor for so many of the things that are keeping us all up at night right now. Coronavirus, climate change, even, in some ways, the threat of nuclear war. And yeah, a sudden blinding flash is different from a rising tide, we know. But just like a tsunami, it's a threat that we know is out there, but just doesn't seem real until it's actually happening. I might be the only person who didn't know what a tsunami looked like until they were a full-grown adult, but lots of people have trouble imagining a nuclear explosion. After all, it's been a while since we set one off.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm going to do one of those like claps. So you can like synchronize, I guess.
You have done this a little bit before, I can see.
Yeah, a few times.
That's Alex Wellerstein, a professor with the Stevens Institute of Technology and a historian of nuclear weapons. And he says, kind of like the way I'd imagined a tsunami as a kid, our ideas about nuclear weapons can tend to be a little out of whack with reality.
Most people think one bomb equals entire world is a blazing ember, right? And that's not true. The reality is nuclear weapons, they're an explosion large enough to destroy a city. They don't destroy, a state, even a little state. They don't destroy a country.
Alex is kind of a rock star in the nuclear community because he created this famous program called Nuke Map. Maybe you've even used it if you've ever gone to the internet looking to understand the impacts of a nuclear attack. It looks like a version of Google Maps, but with a set of concentric circles illustrating the blast radius. The idea is pretty simple. You plug in the place, the bomb, hit go, and bam. All the devastation is right there in front of your face. But I'll admit, there have been a few times when I've gone to Nuke Map myself, and I thought, well, that's not really that big of a blast. Do you ever get that reaction, or do people look at Nuke Map and they go, oh, this really drives it home for me that this is the worst thing that could happen to us ever?
I've made a lot of changes to Nuke Map over the years, and one of the major ones I'm still most proud of is the casualty estimator. If you set off, say, the North Korean nuclear weapon over Manhattan, you might say, okay, well, that's destroyed a nice chunk of Manhattan, but who cares, right? Like, it doesn't even reach to the one end of it.
He's right. The blast would barely break windows on the Upper East Side if it was detonated over Greenwich Village. But if you turn the casualties on, you can see that upwards of 500,000 people would be killed in an instant. 500,000 people gone. Just like that. And another 750,000 would be injured. That's just one bomb, in one location, at one time. Obviously, multiple bombs and even bigger bombs would do a lot more damage. So, if you're trying to understand the scale of destruction, those numbers might help a little. But then, numbers can still be pretty abstract.
The other approach I've taken with this, which doesn't currently work at the moment, which is very annoying to me, but the NukeMap 3D, where you could see the mushroom cloud in sort of a 3D volumetric space over the buildings in Google Earth. Your brain starts to click in how big it is. So my favorite example, I live in Hoboken, which is right across the Hudson River from Manhattan. And if you're out there looking at the skyline, the biggest building by far is the new World Trade Center building, the Freedom Tower. Mm-hmm. It dominates the skyline. It's much taller than even other tall buildings. Uh-huh. If you walk up underneath it, you feel kind of that vertigo. You feel being next to something that's way too tall. Right. If you had a mushroom cloud the size of the Hiroshima bomb, to reach the height of that mushroom cloud after about 5 or 6 minutes, you would have to stack 11 Freedom Towers on top of each other.
Oh, wow.
And some of those hydrogen bomb ones are much larger than Mount Everest. I mean, some of those megaton range clouds, if one of those went off in Washington, D.C., assuming a perfectly clear day, you'd be able to see that from the Statue of Liberty in New York City. That's how big. You're talking about something that's like visible even over the curve of the Earth.
If little Lacey had been aware of the actual size of a nuclear weapon versus, say, the size of a tsunami, well, her nightmares might have looked a lot different. I guess I was aware that nuclear weapons existed and were a threat. I just think at the time that the threat seemed so big, so existential, so that's it, the world is done, that I shut it down. I mean, fallout shelters and duck and cover drills were mostly a joke, right? Alex says they aren't a joke at all. And to understand, you have to look back at the history of what we call civil defense.
Okay, so let's talk about civil defense. Is civil defense just duck and cover drills? Like, what historically did civil defense mean?
Civil defense is any attempt to have your civilian population, your regular people, undertake any kind of action that is going to mitigate the effects of a nuclear detonation or nuclear war if it happens. It's increased chances of survivability and the idea that your society can rebuild itself or your city or whatever the victim is.
So what did that look like during the Cold War?
Yeah, so after the Soviets got the atomic bomb in 1949...
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion.
The first version of this was the duck and cover.
Flushing Meadow, where Russia's Vyshinsky.
Anybody who's grown up in an earthquake zone or flood zone or a tornado zone, right?
I'm scarred for life because I grew up in a tsunami zone. So.
Tsunami zones. I'm an earthquake zone.
Yeah.
And so I know what to do in an earthquake. And I've actually lived through a number of earthquakes. And
that's good.
Every time my automatic programming kicks in, right? Because we did all these drillings and things.
Right.
Basically, duck and cover, people laugh at it now. It's not as dumb as it looks if you keep in mind what the threat was, which is to say Nagasaki-style atomic bombs. Mm-hmm. Not gigantic metro area destroying ones, but sort of ones that'll punch a hole in your city. And that the goal of it was not to save everybody's life. They can't do that. Your school desk is not indeed going to protect you from an atomic bomb going off over it. It will, however, if you're a mile away, decrease your chances of the building collapsing on you, of your windows breaking and cutting you up, getting burned from thermal radiation. So it's mitigation. And they actually have some data that shows that, if people did this at certain distances, you're going to cut your preventable casualties by a lot. By the 1960s, this wasn't really adequate anymore. The weapons had changed. The attack had changed. They've got missiles. They've got hydrogen bombs.
The characteristic of these new missile sites on the island of Cuba indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles.
This is where you see the shift towards fallout
Carrying
shelters.
A nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles.
The idea was if the people survive the first couple weeks, they will be able to recover a substantial percentage of the population, 50, 60%, that sort of thing.
And thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere.
In the 70s, you have some more efforts along these lines, but civil defense becomes very politicized and very sort of coded as a sort of right-wing thing to do. You have a lot of people who oppose civil defense because they think it's about either preparing to die or it's accepting the status quo or will make war more likely, things like that. And the result of all this is that while you occasionally get some little comebacks of people giving lip service to civil defense, say in the 80s, basically nobody wants to touch it. The politicians, the more conservative ones, don't really want to put money into it. And the ones on the left think it's all a sham. And so it kind of withers on the vine. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the history of it, coming up to the end of the Cold War, at which point everybody says, ha, wasn't that hilarious? They hid under their desk. Everybody knows that wouldn't work, which isn't true.
Yeah. And do we have some version of civil defense today that exists out there?
What we have is what they call the all hazards approach.
Which is just what it sounds like. It means today, official guidance around preparing for the worst isn't just about nuclear. It's about hurricanes, tornadoes, all hazards. After all, having a few weeks of food stored up in the basement can be good for all sorts of things. Alex says there's just one problem.
You get nuclear as this like little appendix, like, oh, flooding, tornadoes, wildfires, nuclear war. And you're like, wait a minute, nuclear war, like all of these other things are like natural disasters, and nuclear war is a policy disaster. You can't prevent an earthquake, but you could prevent nuclear war. We can actually, adopt policies and push politicians to do things that would make things safer in that respect.
So get inside, stay tuned. Is that basically the guidance?
That's the current guidance. My understanding is that in the early 2000s, there was sort of a renewed push for thinking about a terrorist nuclear weapon going off.
Once you are inside, stay inside. Close and lock all windows and doors. Go to the basement or the middle of the building.
And there was a sort of re-study about what kinds of activities could be done by everyday people.
Stay tuned once you get inside for updated instructions from emergency response officials.
And could you boil that down into something really easy? Because if it's some complicated list of things, people aren't going to devote enough time. Whereas
get inside, stay inside, and stay tuned.
You should be able to understand that.
Yeah, it occurs to me that get inside, stay tuned sounds a little bit like coronavirus and what we're all experiencing right now.
In some ways, it's similar. The difference is that at least if a nuclear weapon went off, you probably have fewer people doubting that a nuclear weapon went off, right?
But Alex is still as much of an optimist as a guy can be whose job it is to map nuclear devastation. He says, hey, full-on nuclear war, bombs flying between the U.S. and Russia, we're all still screwed. But there's power in knowing that in the more likely scenario, say one bomb from North Korea, well, if you're a mile away from the blast, you might actually survive.
I'm really interested in a lot of the sort of imagination and even policy of like surviving a nuclear attack. They're these really awful, unpleasant things that are not the end of the world. And I've had people sometimes push back and say, isn't emphasizing the end of the world better?
Right. Because some people don't even want to talk about the idea of surviving a nuclear attack. They think it might somehow normalize the use of the most destructive and indiscriminate weapon on Earth. But there's a problem. Because if you just keep telling people they can't survive, they actually do something else that isn't good. They stop thinking about nuclear weapons at all.
My experience is that if you tell somebody it's the end of the world and there's not much they can do about it, they don't really register that very well. They tend to slot it into a part of their brain where that's where you store like the knowledge of your own inevitable death, right? Like things that you don't want to think about. Whereas if it's just something that's sort of awful, then you start to think, oh, this is like human scale on somewhat level, even if it's a very unusual human scale. And then it becomes something you can engage with and have to take more seriously.
Yeah.
I think that's a more realistic approach, and also is one that maybe keeps people from shutting down and thinking about it.
When we come back, we'll talk about the things we're not talking about when we shut this whole conversation down.
The Soviet Union has decided to transform Cuba into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in
Security
Cuba
Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation.
President Eisenhower renews his open sky plan to prevent surprise attack with a striking...
History is made again in an historic room of the White House, the treaty room.
For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction.
And make the United States and the world safer and more secure.
During the Cold War, Americans learned to duck and cover because they were living with the ever-present threat of an atomic blast. The Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s brought us right up to the edge of the nuclear abyss. And over the next 50 years or so, treaties between the US and Russia kept bringing us back. But those treaties haven't necessarily been popular with everyone.
I remember some colleagues at the State Department coming into my office and talking about they were concerned that some folks on Capitol Hill were making trouble for the agreement, that there were critics who didn't like the treaty in general and were just trying to make mischief.
That's Alex Bell. She's a former State Department official and senior policy director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation.
And I nodded and, said I would make some calls. And then I immediately Googled, what is the Open Skies Treaty? Because I had no idea.
You might remember Alex from season 1. Lately, she spends a lot of her time defending treaties because, well, as the threat of nuclear war has become less ever present, the rationale for those treaties' existence has begun to slip away. That leaves the door open for critics to do away with them entirely. And if you remember the image of those mushroom clouds bigger than Mount Everest, well, that starts to get pretty scary. When Trump took office, there were 4 existing treaties. The Iran deal.
It requires Iran not to enrich uranium to weapons grade for 15 years, to reduce its number of operating...
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
This was the first reduction treaty. The Soviet Union and the United States destroyed over 3,000 perfectly good nuclear weapons that they had...
Open Skies.
A long-standing agreement between the two countries and NATO partners to allow military surveillance over flights.
And something called New START.
Both sides would reduce U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals by 30%.
But one by one, Trump has been leaving them all. And now, New START is all that's left.
The U.S. has announced its intention to pull out of a key nuclear weapons treaty, and it is blaming Russia.
Russia has violated the terms of this treaty in several different ways.
The New START treaty is the last major bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. And what it does is restricts each side to 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads. And I know that sounds like a lot, that you would have 1,550 nuclear weapons pointed at each other. But at one point we had about 12,000. So we've done a good job of bringing those numbers down from fully insane levels to, mildly insane levels.
New START also allows us to have a real-time look inside Russia's arsenal, and vice versa. But when he announced the U.S. intention to pull out of Open Skies, Trump was wishy-washy on New START.
When we have a treaty and the other side doesn't adhere to it, in many cases they're old treaties, old agreements, then we pull out also. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to pull out, and they're going to come back and want to make a deal.
And some experts are saying that the Trump administration's skepticism of this type of treaty and track record of leaving now 3 other arms control treaties could mean certain death for New START.
The U.S. killing this treaty now is a major blow to the nuclear security safety net. It will lead to even more unraveling, particularly with the New START treaty that has constrained Russia and the United States' strategic long-range forces.
In Trump's view, the U.S. shouldn't be party to any deal that other nations aren't complying with. The arrangement disadvantages the U.S. in his mind because it unnecessarily hamstrings America. The best move, he'd argue, is to either renegotiate a deal that benefits the U.S. more or get out of it entirely. But if New START isn't extended in February 2021, it'll be the first time in 50 years that we don't have on-the-ground insights into each other's nuclear forces.
And that's dangerous because when you don't have that kind of excellent daily intelligence from each other's side, you start to plan based on your assumptions rather than the reality. And the more you're doing that, the more the risk goes up of miscalculation, of accidents. And that's exactly why we got into arms control in the first place.
Right now, New START can be easily extended. The extension's actually built into the treaty, and Russia has said it's interested. But the Trump administration is holding out. Chris Ford is the State Department's Assistant Secretary for International Security and Nonproliferation. Here he is on PBS NewsHour back in March.
The future vision that President Trump has outlined for this administration of a trilateral arms control agreement that includes both Russia and China.
So they're hoping to pull China into a new comprehensive agreement and threatening to walk if it doesn't agree.
If China is indeed the kind of responsible power that it proclaims itself to be, that there is no alternative but to sit down and take that kind of responsibility seriously in the strategic nuclear realm as well.
Alex says that's not likely to work.
The Trump administration, they want to have this new trilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia and China. And China has said many times that it is not interested in this kind of a negotiation, often points out that the U.S. and the Russians have exponentially larger nuclear stockpiles and need to get their own houses in order before we talk about further multilateral nuclear reductions.
Experts estimate that China has about 290 nuclear weapons, whereas the U.S. and Russia each have over 6,000. So basically, China's saying, call us when you get down to 300 and we'll talk limits. But as for making a deal now, America and Russia, this is your thing.
It's absolutely essential that China eventually be pulled into these kinds of agreements, and we should be laying the groundwork for such a time. But they will join an arms control agreement when they think it's in their national security interest to do so.
Meanwhile, the coronavirus has put an exclamation point on our competition with China, ramping up the tough talk on both sides. And according to the Washington Post, officials inside the administration have even begun discussing the possibility of a return to nuclear tests.
Yeah, one of the first reactions I had was, when Americans were saying we want tests, this was absolutely not the kind of test they were talking about.
The heyday of U.S. nuclear testing began with the Manhattan Project, and the bulk of those tests were conducted in Nevada and in the Marshall Islands, on or near indigenous lands, far from policymakers in Washington, D.C.
What state in the union is going to have to take one for the team so the Trump administration can prove to the world that we still know how to explode our nuclear weapons?
The heyday ended in 1963, when the Partial Test Ban Treaty did away with testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. But not underground. According to the Post, the proponents of testing argue that the U.S. should resume testing now because Russia and China have been conducting low-level nuclear tests of their own. But so far, there's no evidence that's true. Alex says there's another reason for the threat of nuclear testing.
The reporting said the Trump administration wanted to kind of pressure China to the table through this demonstration of a nuclear explosion. And if we, are going to burn down the house around us in order to get the Chinese to the table, I don't know that that's going to work.
Because a return to nuclear testing isn't just a little bit of a provocative act. Communities are still dealing with the environmental and health consequences of the last round of U.S. testing.
This month marked the 70th anniversary of the first test of a nuclear bomb.
In a part of New Mexico's desert called Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death.
Boom, that thing exploded.
A tremendous flash came first.
It was a big explosion. It wasn't like the regular ones we'd been hearing.
But no one told residents to evacuate, even as radioactive ash poured down.
It was on our food. It was on our chickens.
Some radiation levels were almost 10,000 times what is currently allowed in public areas.
The government came into our backyard and used us as guinea pigs.
There isn't a family in Tularosa that don't have somebody in their family with cancer. Maybe.
There's too much cancer here.
which is part of the reason why we haven't done it in almost 3 decades. We even signed but haven't yet ratified a treaty banning testing altogether, which, by the way, some allies of the president have pushed him to unsign. Not to mention, a lot of experts say that a new nuclear test at this time could lead other countries to follow suit.
And on the point of great power competition, I think what we're not talking about is what are we competing over? Mm-hmm. What is the goal of what we're doing here? Are we going to compete in an arms race? Is that the goal? Is it a conventional and nuclear arms race that we're facing? And it kind of looks like we're going out of our way to start one rather than preclude one.
The way that we're modernizing, the way that Russia and China are modernizing, the way we're talking to each other, are we already in an arms race?
Well, there's certainly heavy investments on all sides. The Chinese are massively increasing their investments in conventional forces, but also moving away seemingly from what has been their posture of a minimal deterrent, that they feel comfortable with a small amount of nuclear weapons, feel that that would deter any possible nuclear attack, and also have had a no first use policy stating that they would never be the first to start a nuclear war. And there are definite concerns about China moving away from that posture and from that policy.
And the situation could easily escalate out of control. Recently, Trump's special envoy on arms control, Marshall Billingsley, said that the administration is willing to spend Russia and China, quote, into oblivion to win a new nuclear arms race. Spending we might want to reconsider in the middle of a global recession. But also, spending that might set us on a path towards something worse. Could greater competition and sort of going along the path that we're currently on, are there feasible ways in which that leads us down a path to nuclear war?
Yeah, so we were lucky to escape the Cold War with minimal damage and no nuclear conflagration. And if we repeat the same play now with Russia and China, there's no guarantee that we can actually make it out unscathed again. In all likelihood, the longer we go with this nuclear status quo, the more likely it is that a nuclear weapon is going to go off again. And, nuclear weapons are indiscriminate destroyers of life, infrastructure, the environment, and no country in the world is prepared or ready to handle that kind of a disaster or manage the aftermath.
That actually just set me back a little bit.
I'm sorry. I'm no fun at parties.
No, it's I still feel like a disconnect there. That's what makes it feel really real? And, I think that that's the same thing that people thought when they looked at all of the warnings about global pandemics. And we said, we are really lucky that this hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. And it doesn't feel real until you're in the middle of it, and then it's too late.
Yeah, this pandemic just proves that we've been ill prepared for a low probability, high consequence event. And that's exactly what a nuclear detonation, a nuclear terrorist attack would be.
Low probability, high consequence event. The kind of thing that we might just be a little too complacent about until it's too late. I asked Alex what we can do now to reduce the risk of disaster.
It would be really great if the United States would stop dropping out of treaties. That would be my number one goal for this immediate period of time. But we just have to start talking to each other. And arms control is hard, but really it's the only way we're going to get ourselves out of the situation we seem to be sleepwalking into right now, assuming that we can just keep building new military assets, new nuclear weapons, and possibly manage this all. The Trump administration's really squandering away the inheritance that it received from so many U.S. administrations before that went out of their way to build this very intricate infrastructure to manage conflict, to prevent war. And, one by one, they're just ruining these agreements. And, if we desperately want to get back into a great power competition that mimics the Cold War, except for with one additional actor, we're well on our way. The threat of nuclear war, other than climate change, is the only existential threat to mankind. And right now we're doing pretty badly on preventing that existential threat.
Next time on Things That Go Boom, we'll talk about how China's changed and what that might mean for democracy.
There's just more ubiquitous propaganda, posters, news programs, and they're also becoming more sophisticated. There are rap videos being made about, congressional meetings in Beijing.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. Our show is produced by Ruth Morris, Maren Lazian, and me. Darian Shulman composes our music, and our engineer is Robin Wise. A huge thank you to John Barth for his editorial support. Thanks also to the foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York, MacArthur Foundation, N Square, and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Coulomb Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. If you like the show, please leave us a nice review on your favorite app. We love to hear from you. You can also visit us on social at Inkstick Media and have a look at the rest of the work that we do. In the meantime, hang in there. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Nuclear was sort of the first big federal push. And then it's, well, if we're going to be doing this for nuclear, why aren't we doing this for... Sorry, my dog just came home. Hi, buddy. Good to see you too.